Hey guys, happy Saturday. So I'm headed out to the garden right now because there's something I want to talk to you about that is super time sensitive. Like right now is the time to do this. It might be too late for some of you, hopefully not. It's at this time of year when things are still fresh in our brain. You know, my garden is on its way out. I mean, it's there's things that are still producing, but I would say more than half of it is almost ready to be torn out and ground ready to be prepared for our fall garden. So right now, and I'm telling you, your future self, 8 months from now, will thank you because you are going to make some notes. You're going to start a garden notebook, or even better, I know I'm used to doing video, but if you could just take your phone out and film your garden at this time of year and talk about the things that you liked, that you disliked, that you learned, that you want to change. All of those things are going to be simple facts that you will not remember next year. Unless you've got an extraordinary brain, which is completely different from mine, you will not remember them. So I thought it might be cool, and I've never done this before, is to take you through my thought process at this time of year and go through the things that I learned, that I liked, that I disliked, all those things. Because this year, being on a new property, there's a lot of those things. A lot of things I had to learn the hard way. And I don't want to forget by next year and have to learn them all over again. So let's just get going on all the things that I am going to be putting in my notes for next year. So the one thing that's at the top of my list this year that I probably would remember, but I definitely want to stress it to myself, is to get things planted earlier. Now, if you've been following me throughout this season or longer, you know that first of all, I had to get all these terraces built. And second, I put in all the compost in the raised beds and they ended up being full of salt. So that killed all of my first round of planting and I had to start over. So that, I was already late enough, but then that pushed me even later. And part of the problem with that is, if you notice, all of my teepees that my beans were growing on are empty. Completely empty. Because in the 2 or 3 months that they were out here growing, I didn't get one bean on 2 varieties in 3 different spots. Why would that be? It's because at the time that they were supposed to start producing their flowers, which of course turn into beans if they're pollinated, there was too much heat. And like tomatoes, when it's too hot, they drop their flowers. So out of all of those beans, I didn't get one. Now, ironically, I had some beans survive through the salt issue. They were planted in the salt before I knew the problem existed, and some of them grew, and I wasn't about to dig them up. I also didn't plant any new bush beans. I just was going to stick with the pole beans. Well, the bush beans got planted earlier, and they produced. So that was my lesson there. Now, let me take you up to the pumpkin patch and show you what planting late up there caused. All right, so the pumpkin patch, the pumpkins are going crazy, as pumpkins do. However, I don't have a lot of fruit. Maybe 1 to 3 pumpkins per vine. And when you see some of the size of these vines, I should have more than that. And it's for the same reason. When pumpkins, most cucurbits, but especially melons, when they start getting hot weather, they start producing more male flowers than female flowers. And that is not a good mix. In fact, for the past month, I hardly saw any new female flowers as the weather was in the upper 90s and breaking into the hundreds. So the ones that were pollinated before that heat started, they stuck around, so I will have some pumpkins and some melons. I've got a couple watermelon, cantaloupes, different types of pumpkins. Now that the weather's cooling off, I do see some more female flowers with the tiny little fruits. Will we have enough time for them to actually size up and ripen? I don't know. Probably not, but we'll see. But again, planting earlier will help me avoid this problem next year. The next thing to jot down is that the types of, if you had a certain variety that you liked or disliked of anything that you grew, or if you grew too little of something and you might want to plant more next year, or the opposite, if you planted way too much this year and you don't need to use up some of that space next year, you can use it for other things. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the peanuts. Now, the jury's still out on the peanuts. I don't know what kind of harvest I'm going to get from these peanuts, because peanuts can't be mulched, really, because they have their little flowers that they drop into the ground to produce the peanut beneath the soil. And if you put mulch there, they're not going to be able to get to the soil, which is okay in a humid environment, which is why they're grown a lot in the south. But here we're very dry, and mulch is really the only way we can keep from having to water 2 to 3 times a day in August. And so these plants did suffer. Now I couldn't resist the urge. I dug down a little bit and I did find a little peanut. So it will be exciting to harvest these and see, you know, how it worked in this small space. But I don't know, I'm thinking this might be a one and done. We'll see. My sweet potato bed is just now starting to fill in. I had to plant these late this year. I lost some of my slips. They died, and I had to then order some. The good thing about our climate is these can pretty much grow all winter long. They're not going to be killed by frost. And so we'll see. I might get a later harvest and maybe a little bit smaller harvest than I would, but I still have hope that they will produce a decent harvest. That brings us to the okra. The okra is pretty much 80% of the green you still see here in the garden. They did amazing. This is the best okra harvest I've ever had. We have it frozen, we have it freeze dried, we still have some in the fridge to use fresh. I planted too much. I will not need to plant that many next year, for sure. Same goes with zucchini. Now, most of my zucchinis are petering out now and getting all kinds of aphids and mildew, but some of them are still producing, and we've been giving them away. We've been, you know, freeze drying them, freezing them. At our last house, I always had to plant 4 or 5 zucchinis just to get a bare minimum to use fresh. It took up a lot of garden space because we didn't have the number of bees that was needed to, you know, pollinate them. We don't have that problem here. There's bees all over the place. And so we've gotten, you know, I mean, I can't even tell you, we've probably gotten a couple 100 pounds of zucchini off of maybe 7 or 8 plants. So half of that, are you listening next year, Brian? Half of the zucchinis you planted this year, and probably half of the okra as well. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum is my yellow squash. I did not plant near enough yellow squash. It's not as prolific as the green or the zucchini, and so I should have planted at least twice as many. I think I have 3 plants. I probably next year should plant 6 or 8 yellow squash. Same with the bell peppers. I did not have near enough bell peppers, and because the sun here is so much more intense than our last house, I could always get by with shading them in the afternoon with some taller crops to protect them from the afternoon sun, because that was really the sun that was beating down and giving the sun scald. Well, I did that this year, but unfortunately the sun all day is just too intense, and almost every single one of my bell peppers that I harvested had sun scald to some degree. So I will plant more bell peppers next year, which is probably going to be 12 or 15 plants, varieties all mixed up. And I will probably build a permanent, or at least a shade structure for them specifically to protect them from that hot sun. And I'll definitely make a video on that. I'm going to do some research. I think I know what I'm going to do. Just have to implement it, but that won't be until, you know, next spring. So stay tuned for that. I'm also giving really strong consideration to not growing corn anymore. I've tried it many times. This, I actually did get a harvest. The rats didn't get it. I didn't let them go too long. A lot of times I'll let them go too long and then they're starchy and kind of gross. But out of trying several varieties, I just haven't found one that I love enough for me to give up the garden space that it takes to grow corn, especially when we don't eat corn all that often. So, like I said, It's not set in stone. No, I'm not, but I'm going to be giving consideration to not growing corn. Now, if you know a variety that you've grown successfully year after year and it's super sweet and you think it's worth it, then let me know down in the comments. My cucumbers, now they don't look it right now. They're getting diseased and, you know, they're about ready to be call it a day. I mean, we have so many pickles put up. We have eaten a lot fresh. We've given a lot away. So cucumbers, it was a wonderful year. Probably the best year I've ever had. Unfortunately, I didn't care so much for the variety. The variety was Be It Alpha, and I found it to have, the skins were quite thick, and the seeds, there were so many seeds, and they were not tender. Like, they were big seeds, even in the smaller ones. You know, it wasn't like I let them get big and, you know, I had myself to blame. Even in the smaller ones that were harvested at just the right time, the seeds were very big. So I will, of course, grow cucumbers, but I will not grow Be It Alpha yet. Again, I will try another one next year. As far as tomatoes grow, it's been a very slow year to get started. Again, I started late, and then we had all the heat, so we got a harvest at the bottom, and now there's that big middle area that doesn't have flowers on it. Now that the weather's cooling down, you know, our tomato season can go through November or December, so, you know, we still should be good there. Now, I did do an experiment this year. Accidentally, I thought I was planting a cherry tomato at the end, and so I didn't prune it, I didn't put any strings for it. It ended up being a Kellogg's breakfast, and so I was able to see the difference between the Kellogg's breakfast being pruned, because everyone always argues with, well, not everyone, a lot of people argue that I'm cutting off all the side growth, and in doing that I'm cutting off a lot of tomatoes. So over here in the corner I have a Kellogg's breakfast tomato going crazy that was allowed to just grow like a cherry tomato, and then next to it I've got the ones that are trained on the strings, side shoots pruned. So which ones produced the most tomatoes so far? I'm not going to break it up by plant. I'm going to break it up by the amount of space that it took. And I have gotten more tomatoes. Now, I will be fair and I will say it was not a ton more on the pruned ones than the non-pruned ones. However, I lost a lot more in the unpruned Kellogg's breakfast plant because some of them were just buried so deep in foliage that I couldn't even see them, and the others were kind of half buried. I could see them, and when I picked them, I noticed they had been eaten on by squirrels or something. I couldn't get in there to wrap them as I could very easily do the ones that were tied up on the strings. So I still say it is better to prune and string your indeterminate tomatoes. Let me know what you guys think. So while we're talking tomatoes, let's talk about cherry tomatoes. I guess I don't need as many cherry tomatoes as I thought. So one plant next year, Sun Gold of course, because they are delicious, I think will be more than sufficient for my needs. Also, I think I need to add more space. We are adding on to this tomato bed, and a good majority of that space needs to be paste tomatoes. I think we need more paste tomatoes for sauces and for putting up, freezing and things, rather than eating fresh tomatoes, because it's just the three of us, and you know, 1 or 2 plants would probably give us enough for that and for giving away. Also, wrapping the tomatoes in tulle and securing them with a clothespin, that has done wonders for keeping the squirrels from eating them. We haven't lost one that was wrapped. And just having that tulle on hand next year early, and remembering to put it over some of my starts that the squirrels eat. They were eating my okra coming up right and left. Once I put the tulle on there, they left it alone. So that's a big one for me to remember. And if you guys want to copy that, it works. The amount of basil planted this year was perfect. Probably could have even done a little bit more. I just chopped it all back yesterday and made so much pesto you wouldn't believe. I think we've gotten several quart jars of pesto. I put them in smaller jars, but several quarts worth. A couple of things that don't have to do with actual plants would be have to do with keeping things moist enough. I was not expecting such a hot, dry climate here. I guess I should have expected it, but I held off on mulching for too long. I had straw up there and I was kind of giving it an evaluation period because I'm so afraid of introducing grazon, and so I just didn't mulch, and this garden didn't get watered nearly enough throughout the month of August as it should have. I finally added the mulch, and that's when things really started to look so green and so lush. Along the same lines, I also need to remember next year in late July, early August, to up the drip system to once per day. It needs to come on once per day, about 20 minutes, and that seems to have been the little magic sweet spot that this garden needed. So I do hope that this video came across how I wanted it to. I wanted to impress upon you the importance of keeping notes year to year. I also was hoping that in doing it out loud in front of you, you might get a few things clicked that maybe you weren't thinking of, that maybe you do want to jot down for next year. So if you learned something, please give the video a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. Share the video with a friend, and I'll see you next time.